Aspect 2 of evaluating reasoning concerns an evaluation of whether or not the reasoning supports the conclusions. This is where we get closer to questions of logic. Again, I'm going to boil this down as much as possible to get across the task of hacking argument as efficiently and leanly as I can. Our focus here is on whether the argument works as a matter of logic and reasoning. In other words, do the moves or inferences work? Now, before we can answer this question, we need to decide if the reason is even relevant to the conclusion, in the special sense of making a difference either way to the acceptability of the conclusion. Relevance in this sense is a kind of threshold issue. Once you've decided that a reason is relevant, you need to decide whether or not it counts for or against the conclusion, because not all relevant reasons will support the conclusion. And then you need to think about what degree of support the reason gives. Is it strong support or weak support? Let's play with an example just to make sure we have this clear. Pause the video and have a look at this conclusion and the reasons offered. See if you can see if the reasons are relevant in the sense that they make any difference either way to the conclusion. Then see if any reasons, relevant reasons that is, count for or against the conclusion. Then see what degree of support any reason you find that supports the conclusion offers. Here's an image of the argument with the answers provided. How did you do? Even if you didn't do well, don't worry. The point of all this is to get you to understand what argument is, how it fits together, and the difference between analysing and evaluating argument as stages of thinking about how argument works. At the end of this lecture, we'll sum the entire hack up in a very tight little package, and just having that little package of steps, even if you're not an expert in critical reasoning, will take you a long way, both in relation to assessing argument and in relation to making your own argument stronger. So let's move on. So we've introduced assessing the reasons, and we've looked at the threshold question of relevance. Now we're moving on to look at how to evaluate the inferences or the moves of the argument. This is about whether the argument works as a matter of logic. Our first little hack for this is a test called the initial test for inferences. For a conclusion to be sound, the inferences have to be valid. That is to say, there must not be a logical flaw in the move from reason to conclusion. Luckily, the initial test for inferences helps us answer the question of whether or not the inferences are valid pretty quickly. It's also called the practical test for inferences, and it's a great little part of hacking argument. Pause and look at this image so that you know what the test is. Let's look at a practical example. Can we imagine that if it is true that everyone who works out regularly at the gym has good muscles, and that Mel does not have good muscles, that it is false that Mel does not work out regularly at the gym? We can't really imagine that, can we? Not really. That argument seems to pass the initial test for inferences because we seem driven to accept the conclusion as a matter of logic. If it is true that everyone who works out regularly at the gym has good muscles, and Mel doesn't have good muscles, then it must be the case that Mel does not work out regularly at the gym. So it's impossible to imagine that the reasons are true and the conclusion is false at the same time. Can we, on the other hand, imagine that if it is true that everyone who works out regularly at the gym has good muscles, and that Mel has good muscles, it is false that Mel works out regularly at the gym? Yes, we can imagine that. We can imagine that the reasons are true and the conclusion is false, because maybe it's true that everyone who works out at the gym has good muscles, and Mel has good muscles because she's a rock climber, or a ballet dancer, or just a mother who has to lift a large toddler and multiple bags of shopping around regularly up and down a long flight of stairs. We can, in other words, imagine that the reasons are true and that the conclusion is false. That means that this argument fails the initial test for inferences. It has a logical flaw. We could go into logical jargon to explain this and the analysis of logical forms, but we don't need to. We can just apply this simple hack. It's enough for us now and enough for our general purposes. So now we have a bottom line for sound argument. Sound argument needs two things: reliable reasons and reliable inferences. If the reasons are reliable but the inferences are weak or flawed, the argument will fail to be sound. If the reasons are unreliable but the inferences are good or strong, the argument still fails to establish a sound conclusion. In your essays, you need to produce sound conclusions, and that means you need solid reasoning and solid reasons. In other words, you need reliable reasons and reliable inferences. So, ask yourself two basic questions when you're reading or when you're writing an argument. 1. Do the reasons stand up to scrutiny? Are they good? 2. Do the inferences work? Just apply the initial test for inferences. It will take you a long way fast. Now, obviously, there's a massive amount more that we could say about argument and about the evaluation of argument. We could spend years literally studying argument in depth and really sharpening our expertise. But we're interested in hacks. So you now have the essence of hacking arguments. You've learned to answer these basic questions. Is it an argument? What's the conclusion? What are the reasons? How do the reasons fit together? Are there any unstated reasons? Are the relevant reasons good? Are the inferences good? Is the conclusion sound? Now, obviously, if you want to get really good at that, you need to get hold of a good little book like Critical Reasoning and work through exercises to practice. But you now have the essence of hacking argument, and that gives you a far greater understanding of what argument is and how it functions. But before we finish, I want to give you a little more information to help you understand argument a little more deeply. Not much, but enough, I hope, to really help you understand it and how it works.